Hi, welcome to Ben TV. My name is Eshwar Krishnasamy, and today's show is all about queer people of South Asia. Now, South Asia comprises of the countries Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bhutan,
Nepal,
Bangladesh,
Maldives,
and Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
South Asia has had a really long queer culture and history, as we know. Apart from loving cricket, curry, and the Commonwealth, we're here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the history of the queer culture of the South Asian diaspora. Today on the panel we have Aashvin and Gareth. Now, would you introduce yourselves?
My name's Gareth. I'm a gay male Indian Australian, born and raised in Sydney, moved to Melbourne 5 years ago. I do have some Portuguese and British ancestry as well. I was raised in the Catholic faith, but now identify as non-religious.
Hi, I'm Aashvin. I am Singaporean born but of Tamil descent. I moved to Australia when I was 16 in 2006. I have lived here ever since. I was raised a Hindu but consider myself a dabbler in spiritualism.
So I'm actually a 6th generation Malaysian Indian, and my great-grandparents migrated from India to Southeast Asia as spice traders, and I've been living here in Australia for the last 9 years. The conversation today is that, as we understand, there's a long, ancient, documented history of queer culture in the South Asian diaspora.
So growing up, I had quite a limited understanding growing up in a Catholic faith. So it's only in the last 5 years since I moved to Melbourne that I actually met queer people from South Asia, and even have befriended South Asian people. Growing up in Sydney, most of my friends were not of a South Asian background. So it's been interesting to kind of explore that side of me and to hear about their experiences and the history of queer culture in South Asia.
When you were growing up in Sydney, apart from your immediate family, you didn't really actually come into contact with a lot of queer South Asians. Is that
Definitely
what you're
not
saying?
correct. Yes.
So, and you've found your identity, or you've been able to link yourself with that part of your identity since you moved to Melbourne.
Yes, definitely.
Interesting. What about you, Aashvin?
In terms of my understanding of queerness in my culture as an Indian person, if anyone bothered to investigate, they would see pre-colonial history. There are open representations that are accepted of, gods that descend from heaven and take the form of a woman to, fulfill the wishes of men, or scriptures, texts, art, music, theatre, all have queer representation in them, and that is to my level of understanding of what it means to be queer and a brown person.
So I would agree with Aashvin, even in terms of my perspective on that, because as I was growing up in a very conservative family, it was a little bit strange because on one side you felt the oppression, you felt unaccepted for your gender expression or your sexuality, but then on the other side I've got all these family members of mine who are worshipping trans deities and Hindu gods and goddesses that were shape-shifting, and sexuality was so fluid and it was so queer, colourful and camp, and what happened? At what point did all that change? So similar journey as well.
I think it's interesting that you used the word fluid, because I think before we were introduced these new laws and were taught how to govern our own people, we had this understanding that we were fluid and we weren't people that were defined by our genitals. We were so much more than just we had this understanding that this body is just an earthly affliction. It's not.
Absolutely.
You're so much more than just your physical self.
Absolutely. And there is a huge aspect of the culture that is often not talked about as well, where you don't attach shame to the body. Hence why in ancient, South Asian depiction of art, you see, no one's really covered up, or everyone's flaunting their bodies.
Celebrated.
And celebrated, exactly. Yes. So there was definitely one point in history in ancient South Asia, and I probably would reference India because I could relate to that because my ancestry is Indian, where if you look at ancient temple carvings of Khajuraho, for example, you know, there are depictions of men having sex with men, women having sex with women, orgies, everything. So at what point did all that change? At what point did we become conservative? So as these questions were coming up, and as I did more research and went deeper, I started looking at images, mythology, stories, because as we know, in the South Asian culture, there were many, many forms of how these stories were passed on, and they were mostly oral. This was before the written text came in, but a rich array of visual, performing arts, and literary works in ancient South Asia, where all these diverse sexualities or gender expressions were recorded and they were celebrated. So that led me to ask the question, why are we so oppressed now? Why are we not accepted? And as I dug further, I realized that colonization definitely had a big impact in the region in terms of how we viewed all that. And of course, laws were put into place, and after 300 years, we forgot that we once had a thriving queer culture in South Asia. And that was the debate that I used with my family to affirm my queerness regarding the recent decriminalization of homosexuality in India under Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. Now, what do you think of that, and how do you think that is going to impact us?
So my experience is, and my awareness of is that migrants often bring the values of the country that they left. So I recognise that it's in my own family, and I believe it's been written about in literature as well. And we saw it with the recent marriage equality postal survey. So I guess some visibility around the changes to Section 377 will just bring more attention to those issues that are often not talked about, because the generation that migrated from India, their communication would be limited to mostly just communication with relatives in South Asia. Whereas I guess our generation, we're a bit more attuned to seeing things on YouTube, and we're aware that within India, through cable television they have there, lots of different talk shows, that LGBT issues have been discussed in the media, and I guess that's raised the consciousness of people within South Asia, and I guess I'm referring to India in particular. And I think that'll it's a good way to, I guess it's a way for Australians here to recognise that that India is evolving and changing, and it is the world's largest democracy. So it was great that that when attention was brought to the change in the penal code.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you, Gareth, because I probably can relate to you from that perspective as well. Because as you know, as a sixth generation Malaysian Indian, even within my family, people still have the mindset of what they left behind in India. So a lot of the views back then is still within the family, because they want to keep the culture together, but unfortunately it also came with a lot of Victorian laws that was implemented in India back in the early 1900s, and that mindset is still there. And the fact that India has decriminalized homosexuality now is going to reopen that debate, and that's going to give queer people an opportunity to debate the issue with the family, because families need to know, because they've often used these laws to oppress us.
I think it forces us to ask the question, where do these laws even come from? And what other laws are being practiced and enforced and imposed upon the Indian people, the South Asian people that aren't even our laws originally. I think it forces us to have those conversations, which the common narrative that I hear when I engage with other Indian men is that if we don't talk about a problem, it's not there. So I think, this whole decriminalization will help us open up and have those conversations and actually be able to communicate openly with the people that are trying to tell us not to speak.
There is a level of shame or not wanting to talk about these things because, you know, for 300 years of colonial rule it has changed our mindset, and we do look up to the West in terms of LGBT rights, but we often forget that these were always part of our culture. This has always been part of our culture, but it was taken away. So there is that 300 years of amnesia, I probably would say, where we are not even proud of our queer history and culture, and that's created a little bit of a gap. I think a lot of people are starting to be a lot more aware about this now. This conversation is definitely taking place in South Asian countries, and hopefully with the decriminalization of homosexuality in India, the neighboring countries would follow suit as well, and that would pave way for more rights, more power to the LGBT community of South Asia. So in terms of looking at our own culture and tradition, sometimes, and I'm sure we can all probably agree on that we often look at our own culture from a Western perspective, because we've all had Western education. We think in English, therefore when we look back at our own culture, sometimes we're not aware that we're seeing it from a Western context. We're not seeing it for what it is. Do you agree? Do you sometimes agree with that? Especially when it comes to queer history and culture? Because often a lot of these stories and depictions and mythology and blah, 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 they can often come across as quite, wow, bizarre. I don't quite get it. But do you believe that it's because we can't see it for what it is? Because there has been a 300-year gap, and we've been taught a completely different language and culture that we have somehow attached some kind of a shame.
I'm more of the view that, you know, our backgrounds are quite different. We grew up in different countries outside South Asia, and, you know, for me it's been a bit later in life that I've tapped into my Indian heritage more than maybe someone who has lived in a tighter Indian community within Australia. So more of the view that if we just keep talking, if we have awareness, it's not about, I guess, finger pointing and just kind of accepting history and, you know, just communicating what the history was, and I guess finding a way to move on, and also just to raise LGBT issues and raise issues in other countries as well, and just have an awareness of that. I think that's the core of, you know, where I stand on it.
I think in having this conversation, my intentions aren't to demonize the West or any of the ideologies. I think, you know, there's good and bad in every single. There are negatives of being from the East, and I think it's good that we have these conversations. Is my point, you know,
because some things that were lost were meaningful.
And it's not just that. Like I think sometimes we also come from a culture where if someone is just a little bit different than us, we see them as less than us, and it's almost dehumanizing on some level. So I think it's important to sort of stop and actually see where we are, you know, coming from a lens of privilege and understanding, or maybe misunderstanding, you know, where it forces us to question if what we believe is actually correct or not, and if we are actually doing harm in the way we think and the way we act as a consequence of our wrong thoughts. You know what I mean? So I think giving people a chance to speak for themselves, and also listening to them and what they have to say, rather than, you know, saying you don't get to speak because you are queer or you are gay, or, you know, you are a woman who wants to be a man, or a man who identifies as a woman. It's just, I think the important thing is that we have those conversations and we listen to each other and consider that maybe what each and every one of us says has validity to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the South Asian culture in general as well, as what we can see prior to colonial rule, did have that platform, or did come from a society where a lot of things were fluid. So in some ways, I suppose it is good to talk about what happened or how things were back then, so that some things that we had were good. And for younger queer people now to be able to use their own culture to affirm their queerness, I think that would be that's a great thing.
I guess what all of us have spent many years now living in Australia, and Australia has obviously, as a former colony of Britain as well, has had its own issues around, you know, recognising LGBT people, you know, a strong, you know, Catholic and Church of England influence, has influenced political parties, has influenced many of the laws that we have, and you know, we have quite prominent churches in this country that do control, have an impact in education and social services, and yeah, so I think, you know, India and a lot of the surrounding countries that were colonies of Britain, there's a lot in common that we have, that those countries have in common with Australia. So it's all just kind of recognising the past and, you know, supporting LGBT rights into the future.
Absolutely.
And when you talk about impact, I also think it's important to look at the individual that's before you or that is you, and recognize that you yourself have agency. And if you are that brown, gay, queer, lesbian, trans person, that you going out there and having these conversations and pushing those right buttons and getting people to question their own ideologies as well.
Absolutely.
You know, that in itself is, you know, you doing the work.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So yeah.
And especially within the South Asian queer community here in Australia as well, people definitely do face a lot of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. And they often don't have a platform or a space to connect with other South Asian queer people as well. So there is definitely a sense of not quite belonging here and then not quite belonging there, because there's so many intersections there as well, just as much as how we are. You're Anglo-Indian, first generation Australian, Singaporean Indian, of Tamil descent, and you migrated to Australia in 2006, and I'm sixth generation Malaysian Indian, and I moved here 9 years ago. So our stories are all quite diverse, but somehow the identity of where we come from, which is South Asia, is the one that unites us at the end of the day. Because there's definitely a link between culture, history, and family, because family means a lot to us as well, and hence why having these conversations about history and culture to our family is sometimes the only way to stamp our mark that, hey, we're here, we exist. So thank you, Aashvin and Gareth, for being part of this discussion. I think we've had a pretty interesting discussion today. I hope that after today's discussion that you've got a little bit more of a better understanding about the culture and the history of queer people of South Asia. Hope to see you next time. Thank you.